This is a story about English, the language that you and I both speak. And maybe you speak other languages too. But did you know the language that we speak has changed many, many times over the centuries? Indeed, English appeared as a distinct language 1400 years ago, and it's been changing ever since. Languages evolve and change just like plants and animals do. Why do you think that is? Usually, there's a big change for the people speaking that language. Maybe they left the place they were living and migrated somewhere else. Maybe a new group of people came, either peacefully or violently, and introduced a new language that got mixed in with the first. Maybe there were many new inventions all at once. For example, we've recently needed words like internet, computer, Facebook. You can probably think of more examples. The earliest version of English, which we call Old English, first emerged in the 5th century Common Era, or we call it CE. What we now call England and Wales had been part of the Roman Empire, and when the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE, there were battles over who would be in power in the British Isles. The Anglo-Saxons were a group of Germanic peoples living in Northern Europe, and depending on who you ask, they either settled or invaded the land. The languages they spoke in Northern Europe mixed with and changed the indigenous languages already on the island and became something new, Old English. About half the words we use now in English come from Old English, and yet most modern English speakers find it difficult, if not impossible, to understand Old English. Listen to these first lines from the epic poem Beowulf, the most famous surviving literary work written in Old English, and see what I mean. Hwet we gardina in gjardigum, therd kunniga frimge frönen, hutha ethelingas ellen tremedan, afskul skefin, schaftene freatum, monigan methum, meoda settla oftea, exora earla, sidden eras weird, verschaft funden, hedes frofre gebed, wegs under wolknum, weers munden tha, othet him egwilk, thara sittendra over hun reda, hier in skolde, gomgen gildan, that was good kingen. Vikings began to invade parts of Great Britain at the end of the 8th century CE. These Scandinavians spoke Old Norse, and eventually they controlled a large part of the island. The languages of Old English and Old Norse went through a kind of fusion, and we still use many of these Norse words frequently, like skill, sky, window, anger, leg, law. Even the words they are replaced the Old English words that still remain in German, sie sind. This starts to explain why some of our verbs are so strange. You can find examples of place names all over England that end in shire, shire, also pronounced shire, meaning a district in Old English, and by, or be, which comes from the Old Norse. You could look on a map for some of these place names. English changed substantially in the year 1066 CE, so much so that it was called Middle English and no longer Old English. Can you imagine everything changing suddenly in a year? I bet you probably can. In the year 1066 CE, the King of England died, King Edward, and it was not clear who would be king next. A man named William the Conqueror said that King Edward had promised him the throne. There was just one problem. William lived in what we now call France, not England. In order to claim the throne, William led an army of people called the Normans to invade Great Britain. Based on his name, William the Conqueror, do you think he was successful? Yes, this Norman invasion worked, and for hundreds of years afterward, the Norman French language was regarded as the language for higher class people, and English was for lower class people. Even though people still spoke English, many words from French were adopted. Even now, there are words that sound fancier to us just because the root is from Old French instead of Anglo-Saxon. For example, to buy and to purchase are synonyms. These are verbs that mean the same thing, but doesn't I'll purchase some food sound just a little bit fancier than I'll buy some food. Room and chamber are synonyms. They're nouns that have the same meaning. But can you imagine your parents saying, "Go to your chamber"? It sounds a bit more elegant. The Anglo-Saxons had needs. The Normans had requirements. The Anglo-Saxons were afraid of snakes, and the Normans were afraid of serpents. You can find a lot more examples like this. A new king, also named Edward, King Edward III, decided in the early 1300s that he would run the country in English again, and not French anymore. And so French became less popular, and English was once again the language of government, of literature, and culture. Middle English had changed a lot from Old English, though. Plurals were made with an S at the end of words, instead of the plural en or n from Old English. So, in Old English, people talked about children and oxen. In Middle English, they talked about apples and oranges. The letters th came to mean both the sounds th and th. And many words had e's on the end of them, which have since become silent. And you know what common word appeared in 1200? The word the. Can you imagine English without the? While Middle English is still different from the language we speak, you'll probably recognize more of the words and sounds. This is from Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, which was written in the 1300s. Juan that April, with his sure sota, the drocht of March hath perse to the rota, and better every vein and sweet liquor, of which thereto engendered is the fleur. When Zephyr seek with his sweet breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath, the tender cropis and the young Azona, hath in the ram his halfa cour zirona. Something began in the 1300s that would change much of Europe, and certainly English itself. This was the Renaissance, a new flourishing of art, music, philosophy, science, and culture. Many new words were needed for these new ideas. People decided to use and create new words based on Latin and Greek. English adopted many new Latin and Greek roots, prefixes, and suffixes. Think of all the words you've learned in your studies and all of the Latin and Greek roots we've told you about. Parts of the plant in biology, names of polygons in geometry, layers of the earth in geography. All of these words come from Latin and Greek, as do the words biology, geometry, and geography. Something else happened to English at the same time. There was a great change in pronunciation from about 1400 to 1700 CE. We call this the Great Vowel Shift. It's still unclear exactly why this happened. Perhaps people were either trying to sound more French or less French, and that changed the way English sounded. Perhaps it was because of people traveling more, bringing new pronunciation from mainland Europe to London. This shift of pronunciation created the next stage in English, early modern English. Even as sounds changed quite a lot, the way words were spelled became standardized because of the introduction of the printing press in London. This explains more odd patterns in our language. For example, in early modern English, you would say knife, gnat, and sword. Instead of knife, gnat, and sword, the spelling stayed the same as the pronunciations changed. You may have heard of the playwright and poet William Shakespeare. While some of his wording sounds old to us, this is in fact early modern English. Listen to the beginning of Romeo and Juliet in the way Shakespeare would have pronounced it.
Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our sin. From ancient grudge bred to new mutiny, where civil blood lays civil lands unclean. From forth the fatal lines of theirs two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take the life, whose misadventured, piteous overthrows doth with their death bury their parents' strife.
Around the time that Shakespeare was alive, the late 1500s, English sailors began to take trips across the ocean to explore, establish colonies, and buy and sell goods from around the world. The history of these explorations, colonies, and rebellions is not a peaceful one. You probably know about the United States of America's Revolutionary War for independence from Great Britain. There are many more stories like this from around the world. But at one time, the British Empire covered a full fourth of all the land and ruled over more than 400 million people. One of the results of this empire is that the English language spread all over the world. And as it spread, it began to take on new words from many more languages, and it continued to grow and change. So, finally, we come to the language that you and I speak, sometimes called present-day English or late modern English. There are estimated to be between 1 and 2 billion people who speak English now, all across the world. So English will continue to grow and change. You might like to think, as I do, of English words as fossils, each one telling us a little bit about when and where it came from. Maybe from the Anglo-Saxons, maybe from the Vikings, maybe from the Normans or Renaissance thinkers, or from local indigenous languages like the names Minnesota and Mississippi. Or maybe even from an individual like Shakespeare who loved to create new words. Maybe you'll create a new word that will be added to our language.